Okay.
Coffee, anybody? Would you like some?
Okay, I think we can go ahead and begin. Yes?
Right.
So fantastic. Welcome, everyone. My name is Nara Milanish. I am director of CEMECA, the Center for Mexico and Central America at Columbia. I am thrilled to welcome Professor Lourdes Arizpe Schlosser to our virtual space today. I'd like to introduce her, then I will pass the floor, or the rectangle as it were, over to her, and she will present her research, and then we will have time for a little bit of question and answer at the end. So I should start by saying that Professor Arizpe almost doesn't require an introduction. As many of our participants will know, she is a pioneering anthropologist of Mexico. Her wide-ranging work has explored indigenous peoples and cultures, migration, rural development, environment, gender, cultural and social sustainability, which is to say some of the classic themes, many of the classic themes of anthropological inquiry. She is professor of anthropology at the UNAM, former director general for culture at UNESCO. She is the recipient of too many awards to name. I was just looking at her CV, but more than just a recipient of awards, one knows one has really arrived academically at the pinnacle of academic life when you have awards named for you. And in fact, a number of years ago, Professor Arizpe had an award named for her by the American Anthropological Association. She has held a number of international positions, again, too numerous to mention. I will mention, in fact, just one. She was a visiting scholar at the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia, New York, last year. It was during the very quiet COVID summer of 2021, when there was relatively little academic, in fact, very little academic life happening, and intellectual life happening on campus. And so it seemed that we only fitting to invite her back, aunque sea en forma virtual, to campus to share some of her research and to enrich our intellectual life with her work. So welcome, Professor Arizpe, and I turn the rectangle to you.
Thank you very much. This is the first time that I hear the reference to a rectangle. And in truth, it is a rectangle that we are all speaking on. Anthropologists could make a very interesting symbolic interpretation of this. Nara Mirolovich, thank you very much for this very effective introduction. And I thank you especially for the pleasure that I will have of speaking to colleagues in Columbia University that I was unable to speak to when I was there in the spring of last year in the sabbatical because of COVID restrictions. I would like to say, quiero decirles a mis colegas de Latinoamérica que voy a hablar en inglés, porque como fui presidente de varias organizaciones científicas mundiales, me piden siempre que hable en inglés porque les interesa saber lo que pasa en nuestra región, en Latinoamérica. So I will be speaking English because my friends from Asia and other continents would like to also hear what we have to say in this study. I will present a preliminary report of the ethnographic study that we've been carrying out in Tepoztlan for the last 2 years, 2020 and 2021. It happened that I decided to confine myself in Tepoztlan. I had a weekend house there, and I had it for 40 years. But let me say that I forced myself never to think of Tepoztlan as an ethnographic field of study while I was there weekends. It was only during confinement that I could not help but analyze what was happening with the sudden arrival of COVID in Tepoztlan, this iconic village and now town for anthropology. So, recent studies in the social sciences and on the COVID-19 pandemic have shown that there is no typical pattern in the evolution of the virus in different regions of the world that would facilitate defining the analytical paths to understand the course of this pandemic and its impact on societies. It is clear that the COVID-19 virus is here to stay and will be altering the culturescapes of all societies in the world. So anthropological research must move very quickly to keep up with unfolding events. In our ethnographic study of the COVID-19 pandemic in Tepoztlan, Mexico, we found that the speed and unpredictability with which the COVID-19 virus moved through the local town created several major challenges for conducting research using anthropological assumptions and methods. Anthropology is now being called upon to conduct rapid assessment studies of the COVID-19 pandemic, but it is vital that we also revisit the instruments with which anthropological research is able to grasp such an unpredictable process. In analyzing the volatile perceptions of people about the pandemic in its early stages in Tepoztlan, and the very interesting ways in which they tried to fill the gaps of understanding and knowledge as they adapted to confinement and beyond, our ethnographic fieldwork ceased to be the traditional exercise of stockpiling inherited wisdoms and became instead the pursuit of a detective story. Indeed, we had to follow a meandering detective path, which now lands at the end in digital and cellular communications and in local global interactive networks. And these are the themes of this presentation. The town of Tepoztlan, for those who don't know about it, lies 85 kilometers south of Mexico City, in a valley that connects the colder regions of the mountains surrounding the central meseta with the Tierra Caliente, the hotlands of Guerrero, Oaxaca, and Chiapas. It has always been at the crossroads of the high diversity of biomes and ethnic groups that characterize Mexico. It is significant that it has now become a crossroads of interactive local global connections and exchanges. Robert Redfield studied Tepoztlan as an isolated Nahua village in 1925, and he made it an iconic model for anthropology. And now, practically a century later, this town is a hub in today's complex global system. Anthropology has been entwined with this process and has no doubt influenced Tepoztlan's development. This trajectory, indeed, is a very interesting field of study, a fascinating one. The ethnographic research we carried out began in April 2020 during our confinement in Tepoztlan. The Tepos COVID team we brought together was made up of one anthropologist, myself, one sociologist, Isi Saavedra, 3 young Tepoztecans, one of whom, Esaú Bello Campos, is co-author of our research, and also a mathematician, Leopoldo Núñez, and a statistician, Sara González, who helped us conduct a survey during the first peak of the pandemic in November 2020. We published a first paper in July 2021. Based on the results of the survey we undertook in November 2020 in Tepoztlan. And you will see it in the PowerPoint I will present you, you will see the link to it. The COVID pandemic, recent studies on the COVID-19 pandemic. During the first phase of the COVID-19 pandemic, most social science studies tried to describe what was happening in communities and regions as a contagion spread around the world. As mentioned, many of them found that there were no typical patterns in the evolution of the COVID-19 pandemic. In Latin America and the Caribbean, very interestingly, studies indicate that the heterogeneity of the region led to very different policies and impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic. A few countries were successful in coping with it, Costa Rica, Uruguay, and early on Chile, while others suffered high levels of infection, as in Brazil, Mexico, and devastating consequences in Peru. According to the studies in Ruiz Guerra's book, which are cited in my paper, confinement in some of these countries led to the closing of many income-generating activities and generally of the economies, with catastrophic scenarios for the future in several countries. Also, intrafamilial violence increased with the added burdens of medical and schooling home care falling on the shoulders of mothers and young women. Some governments provided services in remedial social and economic programs in the communities, as in Tepoztlan, while others strengthened the authoritarian tendencies of the political parties in power. Others went further and diluted or entirely dismissed the health recommendations proposed by multilateral institutions, both regional and international. In the regional study, Introduction to COVID-19 in Latin America and the Caribbean, Jasmine Gideon highlights that given the characteristics of poverty and inequality in the region, the impacts of extended lockdowns as implemented in Bolivia, Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru were likely to exacerbate the situation. She notes that among the social costs of the pandemic, it has had a high detrimental impact on gender equality, observed in Times Youth surveys as women have taken on the burden of additional unpaid care work generated by the pandemic. She reports that in Chile and Mexico, calls for emergency helplines for women were reported to have increased by more than 50% during this time. I will be giving you an introduction to Tepoztlan, and then I will give you a series of slides to show you exactly what is happening in Tepoztlan now. There have been some recent books which I would like to note about Tepoztlan, which gives you an idea of this trajectory that Tepoztlan has gone through in the last years. So I will now try to share my screen with you. Let's see. Share. Record, share, right. It's in green. Right. ¿Tú lo haces? Tú lo haces. Just a moment, we'll share. Oh, great, good. It's this is a friend of mine who is helping me with this, and it'll be much easier to look at it. So this is the PowerPoint, the impact of COVID-19 on interactive global networks in Tepoztlan, Mexico, challenges for anthropological fieldwork. Tepoztlan transformed. As we all know, or perhaps most of us anthropologists, in 1925, Robert Redfield defined Tepoztlan as the model for the little community in anthropological studies. In 1948, Oscar Lewis, his disciple, his student, showed that even then the community was connected through agrarian policies, agricultural, trade, education, and migration, Los Hijos de Sánchez, to national Mexican society. Through his study, I would like to say, he coined a very important concept, which was the subculture of poverty, which was then transformed into the culture of poverty, which with very different political and economic implications. In 1997, Ana Maria Rosas published the book Tepoztlan, Chronicle of Disobedience and Resistance, and described the strong social movement of Tepoztecans to stop the building of a golf club in a luxury residential area. Among the objections to the golf course, Tepoztecans said They refused to become servants of rich people who would be stealing their limited water supply at very low cost. This is indeed a current issue. In the 1916 book, Tepoztlan, An Economy of Intimate Experience, Helm Clausen and Mario Alberto Velázquez analyzed the project of Pueblo Mágico, magical town. That was to transform this town into a peasant town as a world-famous destination because of its potential to provide unique tourist experiences. And in 2017, the book Heritage, Tourism and the Real Estate Market in Tepoztlan, Morelos, Alfonso Valenzuela explains the interest in capitalizing on cultural heritage by highlighting the natural tourist attractions, customs, and cultural traditions of this town. Let me just add that the federal Mexican government created a program about pueblos mágicos and gave this etiquette to those towns in Mexico who are indeed magic. And Tepoztlan is indeed a mystical town for reasons that actually are esoteric, but I have no time to explain that. So this is the transformation. This is the transformation of Tepoztlan since the beginning of the 20th century. And then the pandemic came. The pandemic arrived. In March 2020, the first Tepoztecans who were involved in trying to limit the arrival of outside visitors who could be infected by COVID-19 were women heads of households in several barrios. They were the activists. They closed down the two entrances to the town and held their ground, even against the Hells Angels motorcycle groups, who were furious because they had rented a house for the weekend. And so they kept going up and down in the highway, creating a cacophony of sounds with their exhaust pipes echoing in these beautiful mountains of Tepoztlan over the Mystic Valley. The Tepoztecans then demanded that the local government, el ayuntamiento, take steps to organize these sanitary barriers to limit contagions. And they were very successful in a radical action of the local government, led by a very active mayor, Rogelio Torres. Assemblies were held to organize the closure of the town to trade and tourism, and as it was said, robbers from neighboring towns, which is an interesting item. The local government took into account the will of the majority of the people, negotiated with groups that were opposed to the barriers, and was successful in setting up effective sanitary restrictions in March 2020 to September 2020. It was the only town in the state of Morelos that was so successful in stopping the incoming pandemic. However, you can actually see the process in this graph of deaths in Morelos from April 2020 to March 2021. You can see that the first 6 months of 2020, deaths were lower than 20 per month. And this was an average that was lower than the amount for Morelos, or of course, nationally. And so by September, the contagion was quite controlled, except that they opened up the town in September. And let me explain how this happened. As the survey showed, the survey that we carried out, during this period, people began to suffer from lack of incomes in agriculture, trade, and service jobs, and especially in the tourist industry. Lobbying groups then negotiated a regulated opening of the local economy to ease the plight of many families, a decision which was taken in the community assemblies. The next one. This is what reality looked like. When people began dying in Tepoztlan, the funeral processions were endless. The sounding of the bells in the churches went on and on all day. And here I am showing you the funeral procession of a Chinelo dancer who has been accompanied by his mates of the Chinelo dancing, who are going on their way to the cemetery with his coffin. But as we held the survey in November 2020, we could grasp the reactions of people, especially the perceptions they had about the pandemic. So that the next slide shows you what the main perceptions were on the impact of COVID-19 among the 117 respondents to our survey. These are the percentages. They said that the greatest impact had been for them loss of jobs or salaried work, which is the highest, restrictions on personal freedom, and it was especially young people who gave this answer, limitations to social gatherings, to social relationships, which is one of the characteristics of Mexican society, economic hardship because there was no trade, there were no markets, stress, fear, and uncertainty, increase in virtual schooling. The children stayed at home and continued their studies of primary, secondary school at home. No impact. And this was interesting. These were a few elderly men farmers because their activity in agriculture was not having an impact from the pandemic. Mostly they were maize farmers. Health and other aspects. And down below you have the link to the first publication of the results of this survey, which were published in July 2021. In this publication, the results are in Spanish. Our study also showed that the role of local government in people's mobilizations was decisive for the control of the pandemic. However, groups dependent on commercial activities such as market vendors, shopkeepers, artisans, hotel and hostels, restaurants, bars, and tourist services demanded that restrictions be lifted so that they continue with their economic activities, which are a vital source of income and occupation for the people in Tepoztlan. These negotiations came to a head in September 2020 when, after many proposals and decisions debated in the town council, the decision was made to reopen the town while enforcing strict health and hygiene protocols proposed by the community. Unfortunately, at the beginning of 2021, Rogelio Torres died of COVID-19. He was a very active mayor who had negotiated all these decisions. He had also had the ability to ask Tepoztecan migrants in the United States to support buying the first vaccine for their community, whereby Tepoztlan became the first town in the region to offer their people the Pfizer vaccine in March 2021. The next one. So in terms of work, we also have this very interesting graph, which was made by Norma Samaniego, a very distinguished Mexican economist, of salaried workers registered in the National Institute of Social Security in Tepoztlan, el Instituto Mexicano de Seguro Social. As you can see, there's a slight dip in the first semester of 2020 when the town was closed down to visitors. Then after September, there's a hike in September, and then it starts going up until January of 2022, which means that during 2021, there was a recovery, a very marked recovery of salaried work. And I will now explain to you why this is. The magical town publicity, El Pueblo Mágico, of the government program for Tepoztlan had already greatly expanded tourism in Tepoztlan since it had begun in 2010. But it literally went far beyond expectations after confinement. The number of visitors doubled after the end of 2020, notwithstanding the sanitary procedures recommended by the local government during the pandemic. And you could see in the previous graph how there was a spike of infections in Tepoztlan in December, starting in December and January and February of 2021. And of course, people really rushed to the holiday season for Christmas and New Year's, which is a huge festival in Mexico every year, in spite of the infections. And of course, the contagions had this spike. But here we see that salaried work had a steady recovery at the end of 2021. The next one. So if you traveled to Tepoztlan during 2021, you were given this brochure and poster whereby so many tourist activities, attractive tourist activities were offered that young people especially and people from Mexico City just flocked to Tepoztlan. Many new and imaginative activities were then offered to visitors. I'll give you several good examples. The tour of the ancient pyramid up in the mountain, panoramic hiking, tour of volcanic tunnels, rock climbing, hiking to waterfalls and river basins, horseback riding, tours in four-wheeled motorcycles, trip to the, quote, portal of energy, which I haven't visited, and so I don't know what it is, whatever it is. Healing with all kinds of massage rituals and indigenous hot baths. Hot baths, I think you call them steam baths, right? And a tour of Tepoztecan history and legends, which takes place only at night. So you see, there's a variety of activities, and it's full of little restaurants that give you all kinds of food. They give you Tibetan food, they give you Hindu food, they give you African food, all sorts. It's a very varied offer. So what has happened after this, the spurt of post-confinement tourism in Tepoztlan? Next one. This is a first list of the main global interactive networks in Tepoztlan. The stars at the end of each of the items tells you how much these grew during 2020, especially 2021. Traditional national residents, such as myself, many Mexico City residents we had weekend houses in Tepoztlan, grew, and new international arrivals. It is quite surprising that so many people from the United States, from Canada, from France, from England, they all come and want to live in Tepoztlan and settle there for the rest of their lives, or even open up their offices, because now that they can work in Tepoztlan, for their office in New York, they prefer Tepoztlan. They can go up the mountains, they can go to the portal of energy and energize, and so on. So that has grown. But what has grown most is tourism, hotels, bungalows, glam camping, which I recently found out what it was about. It's glamorous camping, but it's called glam camping. Rooms and houses, the Tepoztlans now rent out their houses all the time to visitors. Airbnb has also expanded enormously. During the pandemic, people preferred to rent a house rather than go to a hotel because it gave them more safety from infection. The ecological movements have now moved very rapidly, and now with the problem that the Postland is having of the forest fires, now there is a real mobilization, both of the Tepoztlans and of visitors and of residents, to stop the fires in the forest and to reforest. So that has grown quite a lot. Buddhist and yoga practitioners have come to Tepoztlan since 30 years ago, and they are expanding their groups, and they are bringing tourists who come. A group from Colorado may come to this world-class hotel that Tepoztlan now has. It's called La Buena Vibra, and they come for 2 weeks of yoga retirement or Buddhist. Those have grown very much. And then you have an international artist muralist project. Tepoztlan, as most Mexicans, are very inclined towards the visual. And so they had already begun painting the murals in their village with ecological motifs, or especially the history of Mexico or indigenous symbols. But suddenly this became international as artists came to Tepoztlan, were totally taken by the setting and began to offer to paint the mural, the walls of Tepoztlan, the street walls in Tepoztlan, with very good murals. And they took some of the young Tepoztecan muralists to paint murals in American cities, for example. I will show you some of these murals in the slides that follow. Then feminist international networks also came to Tepoztlan. They came from residents, but also from young Tepoztecan women who have become very active in the feminist movement. And those have grown as well. The New Age interlinked groups were there since I would say the 80s, but they were very small, isolated groups. And now they have expanded also enormously, but less than the other ones. And there was also a very interesting international connection in Tepoztlan, where there is a center for ceremonial gatherings of the Americas. And so there were some dancers who came from American nativist groups who came to Amatlan, which is a little town right next to Tepoztlan. And they could do these ceremonial gatherings for the indigenous peoples of the condor and the indigenous peoples of the eagles. It was a very beautiful new event. Those are still ongoing. But as you can see, what grew most during this time were the cellular and digital communicative info systems, which are, of course, enormously varied, and so I won't go further into that. Next one. So now that we have seen the setting, I would just like to make a few remarks because I'm very interested in this topic. I would like to talk about the challenges that we found in our research, challenges to ethnographic research methods during the pandemic. First of all, you arrive at a town and there is no consensus or any even well-defined arguments about the pandemic, obviously. But we ethnographers always relied on first identifying the patterns, the boundaries, the groups, in order to make sense of the local culture. Well, there's no consensus now. And all movable boundaries are constantly, ceaselessly moving. I will give you only one example. Two young men from one barrio who were farm workers in California caught COVID-19 and were sent back to Mexico. When they arrived, suddenly the barrio divided because some people wanted them to move out of the barrio because they were very afraid of the contagion, while others, on the contrary, were very active, saying, no, 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 they must stay here and we must protect them and we must all help each other. So there are boundaries of alliances, of working together, of trust that are moving constantly. So you have to, as a detective, as I said, as a detective, keep looking for these changes. Then there are very rapidly shifting roles of social and economic groups as a consequence of the pandemic. The towns or villages that we studied in ethnography usually had a very ancient social structure and social organization. At this point, at this time, with the pandemic, these structures and organizations have changed very quickly. So, for example, in the whole discussion about the retenes, about the sanitary barriers, whether to close the town or not, the groups that had been most powerful suddenly lost this power, and new groups suddenly took on more power. So this, you also have to keep looking every day at what has changed in the relationships between the groups. Fourth, it's interesting, the young generation became the communicative transmitters of knowledge. Some of them may be digital natives, but most others at least have their telephone and they are able to use it to access social media, which at one point was their only source of new information, misinformation, and fake news. And five, people were very reticent at being interviewed, especially during the pandemic when we were going around trying to talk to people, both to avoid infection and also because of the general lack of certainty about the pandemic. It's interesting, men refused to be interviewed because they felt that they did not know exactly what was happening with the pandemic. They were losing their authoritative power to say what was happening. And it was mostly women who were willing to talk and find out more about what was happening. Every time we interviewed someone, they themselves asked questions to us. Well, what is this pandemic? How can we treat it? How long will it take? And so on. Next one. So although there are challenges to our ethnographic research methods, there are also advantages. Advantages. There are advantages and opportunities for ethnographic inquiry in the pandemic future. An ethnographer, an anthropologist can follow the mixing, merging, or blending of partial. Hay un cuadrito ahí que hay que quitar. Yeah. An anthropologist or ethnologist can follow the mixing, merging, blending of partial and volatile new information and traditional knowledge. Ethnography can trace also how social media and the internet have displaced old men and women who were figures of authority as the main source of information and opinion. Now, this is a very delicate matter because there's a rift beginning where the young people have the power of the information and the elderly who were, say, the organizers of social structure and social organization have lost this power. So there's a rift coming that is going to change the boundaries within social organization. And this an ethnographer can certainly look into. Third, there's emerging new roles for women. On the one hand, because health is going to be a major issue in all the coming years. And it is women who have the keys to health in a sense, and who are most anxious and willing to work towards defending the health of their families. But there are also the global webs of feminism, which help women also find new ways of expanding their area of action. And so they are able to have a new kind of participation, which also becomes socially important, not in the old sense, but in a new sense. And at the same time, it can also become political, because there is so much more participation of women in the political system in Mexico now. But of course, there's a feminist side, and I'll show you a slide about this. And finally, there's the rise of a digital cognitive politics of information in global interactive networks. And this, the people in Tepoztlan who are very interested in this are usually people who have traveled outside. Many migrants who have worked in the United States and come back to Tepoztlan, or students, European students who come and stay in Tepoztlan for some time, or artists. There are a large number of artists who live in Mexico and are very much connected in terms of this digital cognitive politics. So this is something new and something that we anthropologists must keep in mind. So finally, this is Tepoztlan. And let me just indicate that in the, the sign up in the air, which you can see there, reads as follows. It reads, coronavirus COVID-19 prevention. To our visiting friends, please remember: 1, to use masks; 2, to wash your hands; 3, to keep a safe distance from others; 4, to keep doing health checks; 5, to refrain from drinking. This is a good wish, but doesn't usually happen. And finally, they say, you take care of yourself and we will take care of everybody. So it's a very nice way to tell tourists and visitors who flock really the weekends into Tepoztlan that they should still be aware of these sanitary measures. Now, this is the latest carnival of March 2, 2022 in Tepoztlan. But it's very interesting that one of the barrios of Tepoztlan prohibited the carnival this year because of infection. But another of the barrios, this is where the boundaries are moving, as I told you, said, no, we want to hold the carnival because so many people come and so many people want it. This is one scene of the Chinelo Dance. And I'm giving it to you because on the one hand, you see a little boy looking up at the Chinelo with eyes of marvel. That's great. You see an elderly woman also participating. In the background, you see the huge bottles of beer of all kinds. And then you see the eyes of a mural that I'll show you in a moment. Next one. This Chinelo is a young boy who is 14 years old, and he is also already dancing on the Chinelo. But if you look behind him, you see a quite old man who is very glad to be in the middle of the throng dancing to the chinelos. The Chinelo dance, I must say, is made out of, you jump. And so you're in a throng that all jumps together with you. It's quite amusing. I love it. This is another Chinelo with his costume. Also, although he has a different kind of mask, each of them choose the items of the costume, and they're always different. But please note in the background a young woman who has a very short skirt and a hat, and a young man who is in Bermudas and also has a hat. These are the tourists that love to come to Tepoztlan, because no matter what happens, no matter how much pandemic there is, people continue to get together, gather together, and they have this attitude of, well, life has to go on. A new thing in the Chinelo dance is that women now participate. In general, in all villages of Mexico now, women participate in the traditional dances. This did not happen 30 to 40 years ago. So here you have a young woman in her costume, and her boyfriend is carrying the huge headdress that she wears. And here you have a mother taking her young girl dressed up as a Chinelo, and they're going back home now. But you can see the street where the Chinelos have just come through. And this is a sign in Tepoztlan, which also shows the underside of all this. It reads, "To the memory of all those women who were murdered by those who said, quotes, who said they loved them, or only for the fact of being a woman." It is very sad, but feminicides continue in Mexico, and they in fact have risen in the last period. And so this is a very, very sickening event that is happening in Mexico today. And this is again the photo I showed you earlier, simply to indicate that this is the mural that was behind their dancing. As you can see, it's a very sophisticated head of a woman, and there have been extraordinary murals, which I cannot show you all of them, but they're absolutely beautiful. Next one. And you see that in any street, they just ask permission, the artist asks permission to do a mural in the street, and they granted, the owners of the house granted. This is Frida Kahlo. You can see that somebody did a graffiti, but at least they respected the head of Frida Kahlo. Next one. And this is a mural of a young muralist, a young Tepoztecan muralist, with the symbols that he uses in his painting. It's absolutely gorgeous. And you just go around the corner in Tepoztlan, and suddenly you find these murals that are very beautiful. And they're constantly renovating them, constantly doing others. Next one. And this is an important mural because it was done by the Frente Juvenil. This is the youth front of Tepoztlan, with the sign that Pueblo, people, conserve, protect, and respect your traditions. And they use all the kind of symbols, Aztec, Nahua, from Mesoamerican Mexico, to talk about a banquet of the Day of the Dead. So this is the end of my presentation, and I would only like to say that I've enjoyed enormously presenting this first report of our research, and my exploration of some of the adaptations that anthropology and ethnology must now carry out. So thank you very much. And I'm open to comments and questions.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Professor Arispe. I'd first like to say that everyone on the Zoom looks forward to their invitation to the steam baths in short order, or maybe the energy portal. That sounded pretty good to me. I'd like to invite our audience to participate either in the Q&A or in the chat. Please feel free to put your questions in either of those two places, and we will be monitoring the chat to see if we have participants. Of course, some people are watching this as a stream, so they will not be able to talk to us. But I wanted to start off the Q&A by asking a couple of questions. The first is that you started talking about, you began by speaking about the centrality of Tepoztlan for hemispheric anthropological practice. And I hadn't realized that Redfield's study was from 1925 and that we are nearing 100 years of anthropological study, which seems like such a great opportunity. And I would love to hear your thoughts about that and whether you're going to, write a 100 años de comunidad retrospective of anthropological inquiry in this area. But I wanted to take you back to that initial observation and ask a bit more about, and this is very much, I'm a historian, this is the sort of classic historical question about continuity and change. To what extent do you see COVID, the last 2 years, as a rupture, a departure from a longer history, either of, sort of empirical life, material and social life in Tepoztlan, or alternatively of anthropological inquiry about material and social life in Tepoztlan? And to what extent is this a story about essentially continuity and about COVID inscribing pre-existing patterns? So is this a moment, where we need a new chapter to write the story, the 100-year story of Tepoztlan, or again, anthropology in Tepoztlan, or is this just a continuity of an earlier chapter?
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. And in fact, I had jotted down a few sentences at the last moment on this, but I can't find them. So yes, because COVID is the most visible phenomenon which has occurred now that has these characteristics which I have enumerated. But in fact, so many other things are happening that have the same urgency, the same impact on long-term societies, such as climate change, sort of the whole change in the political economy that is coming. That it's interesting. I see it as the highest point of what is already an iceberg of societies, human societies in the planet, moving along. Now, what is very interesting, I find, is that there's no typical pattern of how societies are dealing with COVID, which is interesting and very worrying, because it means that they have shattered the basic, in some cases, the basic social organization of a society. And that will take decades to reconstruct. This is what's very worrying. So for the time being, what every society is doing is simply trying to fit in the pandemic into the niches that they can find in their own social organization. But there's some basic things that are going to change, and those will need absolutely new thinking. I'm thinking about COVID is a health issue, but it's also a physical issue of our bodies and our place of our bodies in the planet. And that connects to climate change. And so it's this changing, and it's a discussion that is just beginning now, changing our conception of human nature. Everybody is saying there's no longer a human nature. There's only humans in the biosphere. And so it's a total paradigmatic change. I don't like to use the word paradigmatic because they use it too much. But I think we must understand that COVID is part of that. Now, if COVID can be the arrow point that leads societies to change their social organization, it will be very beneficial. But just think that it took at least 3 centuries for societies around the world to more or less develop similar social organizations, political systems, value systems that go with the market, that go with democracy. It took 3 centuries. And that's the size of the change that must be done in less than 15 years, because we only had 15 years because of climate change. So it has to be compressed. And this is why I worry that social sciences must learn to act very quickly in revisiting our methods and our thinking for this. So I hope I gave you an answer.
Thank you. We have a question from Pamela Scheinman in the Q&A, who says, this is a very interesting and perceptive study. Please describe the contents of your questionnaire. So first, a question about methodology, about the contents of the questionnaire that you used. And second, how were sanctions applied to transgressors? For example, masks that don't cover a nose or end up around the chin, as typically occurred and shows in your photos. How did the caring for community or shunning of infected returnees play out? So a question about your empirical findings in terms of community control and response, particularly to those who are not perhaps playing by the rules as established by the community.
A very subtle question, thank you. What I had to do when I decided to start our study in Tepoztlan, I had experience as an ethnologist, of course, but when I started to go around and saw that there was this disparate series of events happening, I decided to do a guía de entrevistas, a guide for interviews, simply, in just a very heuristic way of let's find out at least what we can find out, knowing that there were things that we would not reach. So this interview guide, I chose the main questions that we would be asking. The first question would be, how did they set up the barriers and what happened then? And we have lots and lots of interviews which explain the discussions of who said what about doing the barriers and who had to go there and who were they. And then secondly, economics, what was their impact, the way they described that they had lost jobs or trade or whatever. And we kept adding. We added, for example, another section about women. When we realized that women were being extremely active, they actually set up meetings every Saturday to do barter. They were bartering clothes and food and objects because there was no economic circulation. And also they became very active, connected to these, they opened several sites on the internet and so on. So we expanded according to the information that was flowing in the town at that time. Of course, this would have to be revised in a much deeper kind of questionnaire for the interviews. Then could now be done, now that we know this first stage of information. Now, we did use a questionnaire for the survey, and we decided it had to be an open with open questions because we didn't have time to go through the whole analysis of exactly what we could ask in terms of the actual COVID pandemic. And then I remember what was very difficult was putting together these open questions into categories. So our whole study is based on trying to group the different kinds of questions, the different kinds of answers that respondents gave to get an idea of what was happening. But the responses themselves were rather strange, like these elderly men saying, oh no, I have not been affected at all by the pandemic. But we were doing this at the peak of the pandemic. These young Tepoztlans were going door to door with their questionnaire, asking these questions, and they usually stayed outside. They couldn't go inside. They were not invited to go inside, which would have been the traditional way of receiving them. And so we just had to deal with the situation. The second, it was interesting how it took a long time for people to understand the logic of the masks. This began, it's very interesting, in April of 2021. I was invited to participate in a seminar by the owner of the local transport buses, Tepoztlan, and with several other colleagues, we gave this seminar to 80 chauffeurs in the buses, because this it was exactly very important. It was the best way to immediately get the signal that you had to wear masks. And they came back and said, well, we tried, but the passengers get very angry, and so they refused to use masks. They were taking masks in the buses and asking people to use them. Most people said no, only women started using them. And then, of course, when the peak came, then everybody started using masks. And then it was the women, as you know, women exercise social control in these communities. They were the ones who then demanded that their son or their husband or their nephew or whoever use masks. The men were very resistant to using masks. But there were no constraints, official constraints. At one point in the beginning of the opening of the town, the police took on the job of demanding that they use masks. They used barriers so that they could not go to certain parts of the market and so on. But it was very difficult to get people to comply, and they did not want to make it into a police matter. So they let it go. And so they just put up their sign up in the air.
I wanted to ask a question about information. You mentioned, I thought, a fascinating observation, which is that the ethnographers, in some sense, became interviewees, and your interviewees became ethnographers, in the sense that you all became a source of information. People wanted to talk with you. They wanted to do an interview because they wanted to hear information from you or ask what you knew about the pandemic. And I thought that was particularly interesting, given that you spoke in your presentation about, in several places, about dynamics of information and misinformation circulating. So that this theme of information and how it circulates and who has access to information it seems to be one of the themes of your of the research so far. And so I found it particularly interesting that there's also this dynamic of information and how it is shared between the researchers in the study and your participants or interviewees. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about that. It seems to me that it's yet another example of how Tepoztlan and its anthropologists are inextricably intertwined with one another, that the anthropologists themselves have been absorbed into information networks. So I wanted to hear you talk more about that.
You have just made me think of something new. Thank you very much. It's a very good question, because I had never been in a position where I was the ethnographer outside the group. This had already, because I started doing ethnography in indigenous group villages only. And then I did ethnography in Mexico City. And that's when I found that my field of study my house was inside the field of study. So that had already broken it. But now what broke it completely, this difference, this boundary between us, was that we were as afraid of being infected as our informants. And so we wore our masks, we wore our coats, and so on. And we shared the uncertainty, because even we as scientists who had other channels of information, I kept going immediately to all the channels of information, and there was no information. Nobody knew what was happening. The only more trusted channel was the government conference, which they gave every day of every week, where they informed of the progression of the infection. But this was very, very institutionalized. But at least that was to be trusted, and the people began to trust it completely. So the main doctor in this government program became the figure of knowledge. But at the same time, these conspiracy theories were just incredible. How they arrived so quickly in this town, and then they just spread like wildfire, and everybody began to talk about the Illuminati and the fact that China had invented the whole pandemic, or that the government was not telling the truth, and really everybody had already died of the pandemic. I mean, and it was difficult to counter this information, but we couldn't either become those that countered this information. That was not our role. We just wanted to see how this information or misinformation flowed through the village and opposed and clashed with the traditional knowledge.
Do you think anthropology is particularly well placed to study information and its circulation? I mean, insofar as that this has become such a central issue in so many societies today, the interplay of information and misinformation and fake news, and how do we know what we know? And is anthropology particularly well positioned to help us understand those sort of dynamics and perhaps respond to them?
It's a difficult question, because I would say no, because that sort of information, the way it circulates now in the digital info systems, is beyond the reach of what happens in villages or what happens in towns. It's not like they're totally passive, because they select and they use only certain information. But to really understand the relationship between, say, the traditional cultures and the technoculture of today, you need much more knowledge of the structures of technoculture and how they are transmitted and who transmits it, and the whole algorithmic logic, which is also changing the way people are made to perceive realities. And anthropology does not have those tools. We just know what happens after people receive these messages, and how the traditional way of relating, say within a family or with friends or with the local town authorities, modulates exactly how this information flows and is accepted or is not accepted. That, yes, we can see, but we lack the digital infrastructure at the global level. So we're just pawns in these processes.
I don't see additional questions in the Q&A. We only have about 2 minutes left. Is there anything in particular that you would like to, emphasize about this work? Maybe you could talk a little bit about the next steps, where you see the research continuing, or is it done now? Maybe you could talk about that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, thanks. I have been thinking about that, because the future is going to be a future of COVID illnesses that peak, that disappear, and that will never have the sort of invisible influence of, say, the flu. The flu is a totally different marginal illness now, but the COVID, I think, is going to be central for so many more years. I think it is vital that we understand the dynamics, the social dynamics, and the economic dynamics, because now governments want to go back to the previous economic structure, which created the poverty and the exclusion that has led to even worse results in terms of the pandemic. And so we need to find ways of showing that there's no way to beat this virus or the other viruses that are coming in the future. And therefore, we have to change our methodology. This is why I'm so worried about changing our methodologies. And we have to link up with other social scientists who do sociology, who do political economy, to try and understand how they are going to affect in the future. But I think it's an ongoing process. We've been doing this for 3 decades, when now that things have changed so rapidly and have accelerated. But I think we have to think in terms of this assemblage, where in 15 years, we have to give a great response in terms of climate change, which is our body climate change and our mental climate change together. And so we have to find a new way of rethinking the whole cognitive structure of science, and certainly the assumptions we have had about human nature, about animal nature, about the biomes. So, yes. But thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. And it's helped me very much to structure my ideas.
Thank you so much, Professor Arispe. Thanks to our participants who are both with us and are watching from afar and will watch from afar the recorded event. We'd like to thank you so much and wish you the best of luck with your research, and thank you for that enlightening presentation. So we will be concluding here. And once again, I'd like to thank everyone on behalf of the Center for Mexico and Central America at Columbia, of course, above all, our speaker, Professor Arispe. Saludos.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.